The Ghost Bus of Silent Grove. In the depths of the Silent Grove jungle, there exists an urban legend that has haunted the locals for generations. The tale speaks of a bus, numbered 1138, that mysteriously vanished one foggy night along with its passengers. Many have tried to dismiss the legend as a mere ghost story, but those who dare to venture too close to the heart of the jungle know better. This is the story of how the legend came to be and the chilling truth behind it. It was a humid, late summer evening when bus 1138 pulled out of the depot, its headlights piercing the growing darkness. The driver, a seasoned veteran named Joe Martinez, had driven this route hundreds of times. The route was notorious for its treacherous curves and dense, overhanging foliage that swallowed the road. But Joe was confident, perhaps a bit too much so. The passengers were a mix of weary travelers and local villagers heading back to their homes. There was Mrs. Carmichael, a school teacher returning from a visit to her sister, a group of college students on a field trip, and an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, heading back after a day in the market. The bus was filled with the low hum of conversations and the occasional laughter as the trees outside became a blur of green shadows. As they ventured deeper into the jungle, an unexpected storm began to brew. Dark clouds rolled in, and the first raindrops splattered against the windshield. Joe turned on the wipers, but the rain quickly became a torrential downpour. The winding road grew slick and treacherous. Thunder rumbled ominously, and flashes of lightning illuminated the dense jungle. The passengers fell silent, unease settling over them like a thick fog. Joe gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning struck a tree near the road, sending it crashing down in front of the bus. Joe slammed on the brakes, and the bus skidded to a halt, narrowly avoiding disaster. Shaken, he realized they were now trapped, the road blocked by the massive tree. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the jungle seemed to close in around them. Joe turned to the passengers. "Everyone, please stay calm. We're going to have to wait this storm out. I'll try to call for help." He reached for his radio, but it was dead. The storm must have knocked out the signal. Panic began to ripple through the bus. The college students whispered among themselves, and Mrs. Carmichael clutched her handbag tightly. The Parkers held each other's hands, their faces pale. Joe took a deep breath. "We can't stay here all night. I'm going to see if I can find a way to get help. Stay on the bus and keep the doors locked." Joe grabbed a flashlight and an emergency kit, then stepped out into the pouring rain. The jungle was a cacophony of sounds: the relentless pounding of the rain, the rustling of leaves, and the distant cries of unseen animals. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing little more than an endless expanse of trees and undergrowth. Back on the bus, the passengers huddled together, trying to keep their spirits up. Hours passed, and Joe did not return. Anxiety turned to fear as the storm showed no signs of abating. Eventually, the passengers drifted into an uneasy sleep, hoping that daylight would bring relief. Morning broke, but the storm had only lessened slightly. Joe was still missing. The passengers, now desperate, debated their next move. Some suggested waiting longer, while others wanted to venture out to find help. Mrs. Carmichael, ever the voice of reason, stood up. "We can't just sit here. If Joe hasn't returned, something must be wrong." We need to stick together and find our way back to the main road." Reluctantly, the group agreed. They gathered their belongings, took what little food and water they had, and stepped off the bus into the dripping jungle. The path was treacherous, the ground slippery and uneven. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the jungle seemed to become. As they trudged through the underbrush, one of the students, Lisa, stumbled upon something strange, a clearing with what appeared to be an old abandoned village. The structures were dilapidated, overgrown with vines and moss. It was as if the jungle had reclaimed the land. "Look at this place," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "What happened here?" Mr. Parker, who had lived in the area all his life, looked around, his face ashen. "This is Silent Grove. My grandfather used to tell stories about it. Said it was cursed. People disappeared here." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The village had an eerie, timeless quality to it, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. But what struck them the most was a sense of being watched, an unseen presence lurking just beyond their line of sight. As they explored the village, strange things began to happen. Shadows flitted at the edge of their vision, and ghostly whispers filled the air. The group became increasingly paranoid, convinced they were not alone. The jungle seemed to close in on them, the trees like silent sentinels. Night fell once again, and they decided to take shelter in one of the more intact buildings. As they huddled together, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mrs. Carmichael clutched her rosary, praying under her breath. In the dead of night, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. It was Mr. Parker. The group rushed to his side, but it was too late. He lay lifeless, his eyes wide with terror. There were no visible wounds, but his face was contorted in agony. Panic set in. "We need to get out of here," one of the students cried. But the jungle had other plans. Over the next few days, the group tried to find their way out of the village, but it was as if the jungle itself was conspiring against them. Paths that seemed familiar led them in circles, and landmarks they'd passed hours ago suddenly appeared again, unchanged. Their supplies dwindled, and fear turned to desperation. They started to turn on each other, accusing one another of leading them astray. The once orderly group dissolved into chaos. One night, Mrs. Carmichael disappeared. They found her the next morning, sitting by the edge of the village, staring blankly into the trees. She didn't respond to their calls or touch, her mind seemingly lost to the jungle. Days turned into weeks, and the group was whittled down to just Lisa and a student named Mark. They were gaunt, their clothes tattered, and their eyes hollow. They stumbled upon a cave, hoping it might offer some clue or escape. Inside, they found ancient carvings on the walls, depicting the history of the village. It told of a ritual gone wrong, a pact with dark spirits that cursed the land and its inhabitants. The villagers had sought power and protection, but instead they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of horror. As Lisa and Mark pieced together the story, a chilling realization set in. They were not just lost, they were trapped in the same cycle. The jungle, the village, the ghostly whispers. It was all part of the curse. Desperation gave them strength. They decided to make one last attempt to break free. Following the cave's carvings, they performed the ritual described, hoping to undo the curse. As they chanted the ancient words, the jungle seemed to come alive around them, the spirits manifesting as shadowy figures. With a final, desperate plea, they completed the ritual. The spirits howled in rage, but then there was silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the jungle seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Lisa and Mark stumbled out of the cave, and for the first time, they saw a clear path leading out of the jungle. Exhausted and broken, they followed it until they emerged onto the main road. Rescue teams found them days later, barely alive but free from the jungle's grasp. They were hailed as survivors, but they knew the truth. Silent Grove had claimed many lives, and it would continue to do so until someone else was unfortunate enough to cross its path. Bus 1138 was never found. The legend of the ghost bus grew, becoming a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture into Silent Grove. Some say the jungle still whispers at night, calling out for new souls to trap. Others claim to have seen a phantom bus, its headlights piercing the fog, roaming the jungle in search of its lost passengers. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the haunted depths of Silent Grove. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us, would you dare to board Bus 1138? Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and beware of the unknown.
The Smiling Man.
It was a cold autumn night when James left the office. The clock had struck midnight and the streets were eerily quiet. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way through the deserted city, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. As he turned onto a dimly lit street, James noticed a figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on his mind. But as he drew nearer, he realized it was a man, dancing under the flickering streetlight. The man's movements were strange, almost hypnotic. He swayed and twirled with an odd grace, his arms flailing wildly as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. But what unsettled James the most was the man's face. A wide, unnaturally wide grin stretched across his features, his eyes shining with an unsettling intensity. James slowed his pace, unable to tear his gaze away from the dancing figure. There was something off about him, something that sent a shiver down James's spine. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he didn't want to stick around to find out. Taking a deep breath, James quickened his steps, trying to put some distance between himself and the dancing man. But no matter how fast he walked, the man seemed to keep pace, always just a few steps behind. A sense of unease settled over James as he realized the man was following him. He glanced back over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's grin had widened, his teeth glinting in the dim light. Feeling a surge of panic, James turned a corner, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of streets. But no matter which way he turned, the dancing man was always there, his grin never faltering. James felt a growing sense of dread as he realized he was being toyed with. The dancing man seemed to be enjoying the chase, relishing in James's fear. Desperate now, James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty streets. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, getting closer and closer with each passing second. It was as if the man was toying with him, deliberately keeping just out of reach. As James ran, his mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want? And most importantly, how could James escape? Finally, James reached his apartment building, relief flooding through him. He fumbled with his keys, his hand shaking with fear. The dancing man was just a few yards behind him now, his grin wider than ever. With a final, desperate twist of the key, James flung open the door and stumbled inside. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it with his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was silence. James's breath came in ragged gasps as he listened for any sign of the man outside. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no laughter, nothing but the sound of his own racing heart. Slowly, James pushed himself away from the door and staggered into his apartment. He locked the door behind him, double-checking to make sure it was secure. Only then did he allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. But even as he collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over him, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The memory of the dancing man's wide grin haunted him, a constant reminder that he was not safe, not truly safe. Days passed, and James tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind after a long day at work. But deep down, he knew the truth. The dancing man was real, and he was out there, somewhere, waiting. Night after night, James lay awake in bed, listening for any sound that might indicate the man's return. But the nights remained quiet, the only sounds being the normal noises of the city. Weeks turned into months, and James slowly began to relax, convinced that the dancing man had moved on to torment someone else. He even started taking walks at night again, though he always made sure to stick to well-lit streets and avoid any alleys or dark corners. But one night, as James walked home from a late dinner with friends, he heard a familiar sound, the sound of footsteps behind him, keeping pace with his own. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced over his shoulder, dread knotting in his stomach. And there he was, the smiling man, his grin wider and more sinister than ever. James's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The dancing man had never left. He had just been waiting, biding his time until he could strike again. With a surge of adrenaline, James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. But no matter how fast he ran, the smiling man was always just a few steps behind, his grin never faltering. As James reached his apartment building, he knew he had to think fast. He couldn't let the smiling man follow him inside, couldn't let him into his sanctuary. With a burst of speed, James sprinted up the stairs to his apartment, the smiling man hot on his heels. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. But this time, he didn't hesitate. He flung the door open and darted inside, slamming it shut behind him. For a moment, there was silence. James leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. But then he heard it, the sound of laughter, low and chilling, coming from the other side of the door. The smiling man's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "See you soon," he whispered, his words sending a shiver down James's spine. And then, just as quickly as he had come, the smiling man was gone, leaving James alone in his apartment, shaken and terrified. From that night on, James never walked home alone again. He always made sure to have someone with him, to watch his back and keep the smiling man at bay. But no matter how hard he tried to forget, the memory of that wide, unsettling grin haunted him, a constant reminder that some nightmares never truly end. As time went by, James's encounter with the smiling man became a distant but vivid memory. He moved on with his life, surrounded himself with friends and family, and tried to put the terror of that night behind him. Years passed without any sign of the smiling man. James convinced himself that he had finally escaped the grasp of that malevolent presence, that perhaps it had all been a bizarre and isolated incident. But deep down, a part of him remained wary, always looking over his shoulder, always half expecting to see that wide grin lurking in the shadows. Then, one chilly autumn evening, James received a package in the mail. It was a small, nondescript box with no return address. Curiosity piqued, he opened it cautiously. Inside, nestled among layers of tissue paper, was a porcelain mask, a mask with a wide, unnaturally wide grin stretched across its features. James's blood ran cold as he realized what it was, a replica of the smiling man's face. A sense of dread washed over him as he stared at the mask, his mind racing with questions. How had the smiling man found him? What did he want this time? And then, as if in answer to his unspoken questions, James heard a sound, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the air. It was the same tune the smiling man had danced to that fateful night, a tune that had long haunted James's nightmares. With trembling hands, James placed the mask back in the box and sealed it shut. He knew then that the smiling man had never truly left, that he had merely been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But James was no longer the scared, helpless man he had been that night. He was stronger now, more determined. He refused to let the smiling man's terror consume him once more. Gathering his courage, James walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The night was quiet, the streets empty, but somewhere out there, he knew, the smiling man was watching, waiting. With a steely resolve, James made a decision. He would not be a victim again. He would face the smiling man head on, confront his fears, and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. And as he stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, James whispered to himself, "I will not let you in. I will not let fear rule my life. You may be out there, smiling and waiting, but I am ready for you. I will find you, and I will make sure you never haunt another soul again." With that, James turned away from the window, his heart filled with determination. The smiling man may have been a relentless nightmare, but James was ready to face him, to reclaim his life and his peace of mind. And so, the battle between James and the smiling man continued, a never-ending struggle between fear and courage, darkness and light. But no matter how long the night may seem, James knew that dawn would eventually come, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey through the tale of the smiling man. Until we meet again, may your path be illuminated by the light of courage and truth.